Today, we are going to conduct an investigation that touches the very foundations of the chronology we are used to. We are taking a swing at the bedrock upon which not only the history of Russia, but also a significant part of European history is built. Our goal is to find traces of vanished peoples mentioned only in legends and attempt to answer questions that modern science prefers to ignore. For example, why does the prime meridian on 17th century navigation maps not pass through the familiar Greenwich or St. Petersburg, but instead cuts through a tiny, seemingly politically insignificant island? The answers might turn out to be far more intriguing than the dry lines of textbooks. We should begin this investigation with one seemingly insignificant contradiction that has the potential to destroy the entire orderly picture of the past. We are talking about the riddle of ancient geographical maps. If you carefully study the works of the most authoritative cartographers of the 16th century, you can discover a strange detail. The body of water in the north of Europe is designated as the Murmansk Sea. This would not be surprising at all, were it not for one historical fact that is beyond doubt. Official history claims that plans to build a port city above the Arctic Circle appeared only in the 1870s. The first surveyors arrived in these places only in 1912, and 3 years later, the Murmansk seaport and the settlement of Semenovsky were founded. On July 6, 1916, Emperor Nicholas II signed a resolution to name the new city Romanov on Merman, which was renamed Murmansk after the revolutionary events of 1917. The chronology here is crystal clear. The city and the toponym associated with it did not exist before the early 20th century. However, on medieval maps compiled 300 years before these events, the sea already bears the name Murmansk. A logical question arises. How could Gerardus Mercator, the greatest cartographer of his time, know a name that would appear only centuries later? Or are we dealing with an error that dragged a chain of false historical interpretations along with it? Of course, academic science has a ready answer, and it is striking in its simplicity. According to authoritative historians and linguists, the word merman is merely a distorted form of the word Norman. Supposedly, in translation from Scandinavian languages, this means Northman. Based on the theory of historical sound replacement, it is believed that the sound N transformed into M, and the vowel O in Scandinavian pronunciation sounded closer to a soft U. Thus, Nerman turned into merman. This version sounds convincing if you don't ask too many questions. However, upon closer examination, it begins to crumble. The Murmansk Sea is marked on the maps of Mercator, who worked in 16th century Europe. It is logical to assume that when compiling his atlases, he relied on the works of famous European navigators. Until the 18th century, Russia was not considered a major maritime power, capable of making long ocean voyages and discovering new lands. All significant geographical discoveries of that time were made by the Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish. Consequently, Mercator drew information from the logbooks of European captains. Imagine the situation. A Dutch or Swedish ship rounds Scandinavia and enters northern waters. The captains know that northern people, Normans, live in these parts. Logically, they would name the open sea the Norman Sea. And Mercator, being a pedantic scientist, should have transferred exactly this European name to the map. But he acts completely illogically and puts the word Murmansk on the map. It looks as if he used a distorted Russian name. But how could a 16th century cartographer know it? If Russians began to actively settle and develop these territories much later. Even if we assume the incredible, that Mercator somehow miraculously gained access to Russian sources, or Novgorod birchbark manuscripts where the sea was named in the local manner, we hit another dead end. The fact is that in the Russian language of the 16th century, The word Norman simply could not exist in the context we are forced to believe. According to all chronicles, newcomers from the north in Russia were called Varangians, Vadyags. If Mercator had relied on Russian data, he would have been obliged to label the sea as the Varangian Sea. But the cartographer uses neither the generally accepted European Norman nor the famous Russian Varangian. He writes Murmansk. This forces us to assume that Murmansk is not just a translation error or a play on sounds, but the name of a people or phenomenon from a part of history that has been carefully edited or forgotten. It seems we are standing on the threshold of discovering a parallel history where completely different names existed, and perhaps completely different people who do not fit into the official picture of the world. To understand who these mysterious mermans were, we need to deal with those whom historians have appointed in their place, the Normans and the Vikings. And here awaits us, perhaps, the most massive falsification of recent centuries. To accept the version that the mysterious Murmansk Sea is merely the result of a distortion of the familiar word Norman, one would have to turn a blind eye to too much. Official science asks us to believe in a linguistic accident. Supposedly the sound N transformed into M, and the vowel changed its sound when passing from one language to another. At first glance, this explanation seems convenient. It allows us not to rewrite textbooks and to preserve the familiar picture of the world, where all geographical names have a clear and understandable etymology. However, if we start unraveling this ball of yarn, the thread leads us to a dead end. Let's return to the figure of the cartographer. Gerardus Mercator was a scientist with a pedantic approach to detail. Compiling his maps, he relied on the sum of all knowledge available to him. If we assume he was guided by European sources, reports from Dutch, English, or Swedish captains, then there could be no talk of any mermans. In the Western tradition, northern inhabitants were called Normans, that is, men of the north. Sailing along the coast of Scandinavia, any European navigator would have entered the name Norman Sea, or perhaps Ocean of the Northmen, into the logbook. For Mercator, it would have been absolutely natural and logical to use this generally accepted term. But he does not do this. Then let's consider the second option. The cartographer could have used information obtained from distant and mysterious Muscovy. Let's assume Russian maps, or oral retellings of Russian merchants, fell into his hands. But here too, the distortion theory fails. In the Russian language of the 16th century, as in earlier chronicles, the word Norman was practically not used. To designate newcomers from the north, arriving from across the sea, Russia had a clear concept established for centuries: Varangians. The path from the Varangians to the Greeks, the calling of the Varangians. These phrases are the foundation of Russian historiography. If Russian people told foreigners about the sea washing the northern borders, they would have called it Varangian. And this is the name Mercator, being a conscientious researcher, should have transliterated into Latin. We end up with a paradoxical situation. The cartographer rejects the name Norman, understood by all of Europe. He ignores the traditional Russian name Varangian. Instead, he puts the word Murmansk on the map, which does not fit into any of the known linguistic traditions of that time. This word hangs in the air, as if taken from a source we know nothing about. It is as if Mercator knew of the existence of a certain third force, a third people, who were neither classical European Normans nor chronicle Varangians. This suggests that mermans is not a phonetic error or a play on words. It is an ethnonym designating the indigenous population or even an entire civilization that inhabited these latitudes before the arrival of both Russian and Western European colonizers. Perhaps it was this people who gave the name to the sea, and it was their name that history tried to erase from memory, replacing it with a consonant but empty term. To understand who these people were, we need to look closely at those whom historians have put in their place. In the official version of history, this region belongs entirely to the so-called Normans, whom popular culture calls Vikings. We are told that it was they who furrowed these seas, looted coasts, and discovered new lands. But who are the Normans really? If we open dictionaries and encyclopedias, we will see surprisingly vague wording. Normans are a general name for tribes. In France, they were called Normans. In England, Danes. In Ireland, Ostmen, Eastmen. In Russia, Varangians. This people has no single self-designation. It is many-faced and elusive, like a ghost. But the biggest lie lies not even in the term Normans, but in the word that has become synonymous with the northern warrior today. That word is Viking. It is behind this beautiful, promoted brand that the real history of the North is hidden, carefully concealed from us. We are used to imagining stern, bearded warriors in horned helmets, but this image has as much relation to reality as Hollywood blockbusters do to documentary chronicles. To find the real masters of the Murmansk Sea, we will have to destroy the main myth of Scandinavian history, the myth of the Vikings, which was created artificially and implanted in our consciousness quite recently. Now we approach the most massive fraud that has been embedded in the mass consciousness with such thoroughness that today, doubting it seems almost blasphemous. We are talking about the concept of the Viking. This term has become so familiar that we perceive it as an unconditional historical given. We see stern warriors on longships, hear about the Viking Age, buy books, and watch series about their exploits. However, if we discard modern pop culture and turn to the dry facts of primary sources, a shocking discovery awaits us. In medieval chronicles, no Vikings exist. If we pick up Frankish annals, Anglo-Saxon chronicles, or German church records of those years, we will not find this proud ethnonym there. European monks and chroniclers describing the attacks of northern aggressors used completely different terminology. They called the attackers pirates, heathens, barbarians, sometimes simply men from the north or Danes. Fear and contempt for cruel robbers emanate from these texts, but there is not the slightest hint of the romanticized culture of noble warriors that is painted for us today. The word Viking itself was extremely rare in those times, mainly in specific sagas, and it meant not a nationality or tribal affiliation, but rather an occupation: sea robbery. To go a Viking meant to go on a pirate raid. Calling all Scandinavians Vikings is the same as calling all inhabitants of modern Somalia pirates. What we call Viking history today is in essence a literary invention of the 19th century. It was during the Romantic era that European and Scandinavian writers, poets, and artists began to construct this myth. They needed a great past, a heroic epic, to form a national identity. From scattered gangs of sea robbers, who were in fact the outcasts of their time, an image of a mighty civilization was artificially created. They were attributed codes of honor, a complex state structure, and even the famous horned helmets, which, as archaeologists know, were never used in battle and are the product of the imagination of Wagnerian opera costume designers. This situation is painfully reminiscent of the history of Mongolia. We are told about a great empire of nomads that conquered half the world, yet in Mongolia itself, until the early 20th century, practically nothing was known about this greatness, until European educators arrived with ready-made history textbooks. Similarly, humble fishermen and farmers of Scandinavia suddenly learned that their ancestors were the lords of the seas who held Paris and London in fear. History was rewritten retroactively to fill a vacuum. But any vacuum in history is not formed without reason. It usually hides something that does not fit into the official paradigm. If we remove the fictional Vikings from the historical board, a huge and uncomfortable question arises before us. Who then sailed on those magnificent ships, the remains of which archaeologists find? Longships, drakars, are the pinnacle of engineering thought of their time. These are vessels with ideal hydrodynamics, capable of crossing oceans, withstanding storms, and at the same time entering shallow rivers. Is it possible that scattered tribes, described by European chronicles as wild barbarians and heathens, suddenly, without any preceding evolution, began to build the best ships in the world? The technological level of these vessels does not correspond at all to the primitive lifestyle led by the inhabitants of Scandinavia in the early Middle Ages. We face an obvious discrepancy. We have high-tech artifacts, ships, navigational instruments, weapons of amazing quality. But the people appointed to the role of their creators, the semi-mythical Vikings, look like imposters in this role. Someone else possessed this knowledge. Someone else terrified Europe, came from the sea, struck pinpoint blows, and departed into nowhere. And this someone possessed resources and technologies unavailable to the ordinary inhabitants of the fjords. To find the real masters of these seas and the creators of these technologies, we need to stop looking at modern maps where the north is limited by the coast of Norway. The answer lies where official geography sees only an icy desert. We will have to return once again to the erroneous maps of Gerardus Mercator and shift our gaze just above the Scandinavian peninsula to where the 16th century cartographer depicted lands that, according to modern science, were never there. If we turn once again to the legacy of Gerardus Mercator, we discover a detail that baffles most modern researchers. On his famous maps, besides the continents familiar to us, the outlines of which he reproduced with amazing accuracy for the 16th century, a huge Arctic continent is depicted. This is not just an island or an accidental ink blot, but a detailed land divided by wide rivers into 4 parts, with a high mountain in the center, located directly at the North Pole. Official historiography, encountering this image, chooses the most convenient position, a position of condescending mockery. We are told that the great cartographer, who calculated the coordinates of cities in Europe, Asia, and the New World with mathematical scrupulousness, simply gave free rein to his fantasy in the case of the North. Allegedly, lacking reliable data, he filled the empty space with a beautiful myth drawn from ancient legends about Hyperborea. However, this approach looks extremely illogical. Why would a man whose name is given to the projection used in navigation to this day suddenly decide to ruin his reputation by inventing a giant, non-existent continent? And why does this fantasy look so geographically grounded? The answer to this riddle lies not in a cartographer's error, but in global changes in the appearance of our planet that occurred relatively recently. The key to understanding Mercator's map is the level of the world ocean. If we discard the dogma about the immutability of coastlines over the last millennia and assume that just a few centuries ago the water level was significantly lower, the picture changes radically. Geological data confirms that the depths of the Arctic Ocean in many places adjacent to Eurasia are negligibly small. Huge areas of the shelf are hidden under the water column today. If we mentally, or with the help of computer modeling, lower the ocean level by 150 or 200 meters, we will see huge landmasses beginning to rise from the water. The famous Beringia, connecting Asia and America, ceases to be a hypothesis and becomes a reality. But the most interesting things happen in the European sector of the Arctic. The islands of Svalbard, Franz Josef Land, Novaya Zemlya, and the shelves around Iceland unite into single, vast territories. That very fantasy of Mercator, when superimposed on a map of the seabed relief, suddenly acquires physical meaning. What we consider scattered islands today are merely the mountain peaks of a sunken northern land. It turns out that Mercator did not invent this continent. He either used ancient maps compiled before the catastrophic rise in water levels, or he himself caught the period when these lands had not yet completely gone underwater. It was here, on these now sunken expanses, that the home of those mysterious peoples whose traces we are trying to find was located. Here live those whom Mercator called mermans, and those whom Russian legends call the chud with white eyes, chud beloglazaya. This was not a handful of savages surviving on the edge of the ice, but a developed civilization possessing huge resources. Their country was not an icy desert. The climate of the past, as shown by studies of flora and fauna, remains in the permafrost, was much milder. It was an inhabited, blooming land, a true northern metropolis. Now it becomes clear why Normans or Varangians appear in history so suddenly and out of nowhere. They were not invaders who came for profit, but refugees. The water was advancing, swallowing their cities and pastures, forcing people to migrate south to the rocky shores of Scandinavia, which were merely the outskirts of their dying empire. They brought with them the remnants of their technologies, including the art of shipbuilding, which seemed like a miracle to the locals. Those very long ships that do not rot in the ground were built by the hands of the masters of this departed civilization. We are used to considering history as linear, but a picture of a global catastrophe that wiped an entire continent off the face of the earth opens up before us. The Chud went underground, as the legends say, or, in modern language, their territories went underwater, and the survivors dissolved among other peoples, leaving behind only strange toponyms like the Murmansk Sea and artifacts that are impossible to explain. And if we look closely at these artifacts, we will notice that they bear the imprint of a culture frighteningly different from everything known to us. Material traces of this civilization have been preserved, and their analysis forces us to doubt not only the chronology, but also who exactly these ancient inhabitants of the North were. If we stop viewing the material heritage of the North through the prism of familiar textbooks and look at the artifacts without bias, we discover things that do not fit into the picture of the development of European civilization at all. We are talking not only about technologies, but also about aesthetics itself, about a view of the world captured in metal and wood. Jewelry found in Scandinavian and northern Russian lands is executed in the so-called animal style. This is a complex intertwining of lines where animal figures flow into each other, creating a hypnotic, infinite pattern. This style is strikingly different from the strict geometry of Rome or the religious subjects of Byzantium. It testifies to a completely different mentality of the creators, to their special perception of reality, which resembles the structure of natural elements more than human logic. This difference is manifested most vividly in shipbuilding. The famous Oseberg ship, discovered in Norway, is considered the pinnacle of Viking Age art. Official dating places it in the 8th century AD. We are asked to believe that this ship, made entirely of oak, lay in a damp burial mound for more than 1,000 years and preserved its structure almost in its original form. Wood, even the strongest, has its limit of durability, especially in an aggressive environment where there are no preserving properties of peat bogs. However, the carving on the side of the ship looks as if the master finished the work just recently. The tiniest details of the pattern have not rotted, have not crumbled into dust. Such phenomenal preservation suggests a gross error in chronology. Perhaps these ships are not 1,000 years old at all. If we assume that the catastrophe that destroyed the northern civilization occurred only 300 or 400 years ago, then the condition of the wood receives a logical explanation. We are looking at the legacy of a culture that existed in parallel with the monarchies of Europe known to us, but was erased from history. And it was a culture that possessed material processing technologies superior to the capabilities of their contemporaries. But the most shocking discovery awaits us not in ship museums, but in anthropological laboratories. For a long time, historians avoided detailed discussion of the physical appearance of those they call Normans or Vikings. However, an accidental find on the Estonian island of Saaremaa in 2008 forced a fresh look at the question of who actually inhabited the northern seas. While laying utility lines, workers stumbled upon a mass grave of warriors buried in ships. The remains, named the Salma ships, became a sensation, but not the one scientists expected. When studying the skulls of these warriors, researchers encountered inexplicable anomalies. These were not just strong men hardened in battles. These were people with a different skeletal structure. Attention is drawn to the specific shape of the cranium. The occipital part is unnaturally elongated backward, resembling the shape of a melon or an egg. Such dolichocephaly is extremely rare in modern humans and is usually considered a pathology, but here it was a mass phenomenon, the norm for an entire squad. In addition, these people possessed massive, heavy jaws, significantly larger than the jaws of an average person, which gave their faces a terrifying expression. Before us appear the remains not just of another ethnic group, but possibly of another race. In Russian legends, the memory of a mysterious people, the Chud with white eyes, who went underground refusing to submit to the new order, has been preserved. Perhaps white-eyed is not the color of the iris, but a metaphor describing their alien nature, the otherness of their gaze, or the specific structure of the face. Those very mermans, whose name has been preserved on Mercator's maps, and the legendary Chud, are probably one and the same. It was a tall, physically powerful race with elongated skulls, possessing knowledge and skills unavailable to their southern neighbors. Their physiological differences explain the mystical horror they inspired in the inhabitants of Europe. Attacks from the sea were terrifying not only because of robbery, but also because of the encounter with these beings, who looked like humans but were not humans in the usual sense. These were the remnants of the ancient Northern Empire, forced to leave their flooded cities. Now that we realize we are dealing with a highly developed and biologically distinct civilization that controlled the Northern Hemisphere, another strange fact related to ancient cartography becomes clear. If this race dominated the sea and possessed deep knowledge of the planet, then it was their coordinate system that must have formed the basis of the maps of that time. And this leads us to the solution to the mystery of the prime meridian, which, for some reason, passes where today there is nothing but water and volcanic rocks. Finally, we come to the concluding link in our chain of evidence, to a geographical riddle that lies on the surface, but which we are accustomed to ignoring. If you look at any modern map, you will see that the reference point of time and space, the prime meridian, passes through the Greenwich Observatory in London. This seems natural to us, as Britain was the mistress of the seas. However, this decision was made only in 1884 at an international conference. Before that moment, for centuries, cartographers used a completely different coordinate system. On navigation maps of the 17th century, including the works of Mercator himself and his contemporaries, the prime meridian lies in a completely different place. It passes neither through Paris, nor St. Petersburg, nor Rome, the centers of political and religious power of that time. The line of the beginning of the world intersects either Iceland or the tiny island of Ferro, El Hierro, in the Canary Archipelago. Historians explain this by saying that Ferro was considered the westernmost point of the Old World. But why then does Iceland figure so often as the axial line on ancient globes? From the point of view of European politics of that time, Iceland was a remote province, a god-forsaken land of volcanoes and ice. Why run the axis of the world through it? The answer becomes obvious if we accept the hypothesis of the existence of a developed northern civilization, the very one we called the land of the mermans. For them, this region was not the outskirts. It was the center of their empire. The prime meridian passed through Iceland not by chance. This island, which is the peak of the mid-Atlantic ridge, is the only large piece of land remaining from the sunken continent, the outlines of which Mercator preserved for us. Iceland was likely the sacred or technological center of this lost culture. Here we can recall the legend of the Chud people who went underground. Iceland, with its incredible volcanic activity, geysers, and crustal fractures, is ideally suited for the role of a place where entrances to those very underground cavities existed. Perhaps huge lava tubes and caves were used by this race as shelters or transport arteries when the climate began to change, or when the water level began to rise catastrophically. The prime meridian pointed exactly to this entrance, to the heart of their world, which continued to beat even after most of the land disappeared into the abyss. It turns out that the maps used by European navigators in the Age of Discovery were not created by them from scratch. They were copied. They were redrawings of more ancient sources inherited by humanity from that very tall, white-eyed race with elongated skulls. Europeans, having received this knowledge, simply used it without fully understanding the true meaning of the drawn lines. They saw the exact outlines of the shores, but did not know that the Murmansk Sea was named after the masters of these waters, and the prime meridian pointed to the capital of a vanished world. The entire history of ancient Rus and medieval Europe is built on the ruins of this civilization. We occupied their lands, appropriated their shipbuilding technologies, but, unable to explain their origin, invented convenient fairy tales. We invented the myth of wild but noble Vikings to hide the fact that quite recently, perhaps only 300 or 400 years ago, another intelligent force existed beside us. A force that was erased by a natural cataclysm and the subsequent rewriting of history. The Romanovs, European monarchs, and court scientists did everything to erase the memory of the Northern Empire. The city of Romanov on Merman was founded in the 20th century to close the void on the map and legalize a name that was an eyesore. Mermans turned into an incomprehensible set of sounds, and the great tragedy of the flood was masked as centuries of evolution. Our investigation comes to an end today, but questions remain. We have only cracked open the door to the dark room of the past. Mercator's maps, strange skulls, non-rotting longship wood, and the displaced center of the world. All these are parts of one mosaic. We still have much to rethink. Perhaps it is worth taking a closer look at other errors on ancient maps, and at what is actually hidden in the depths of the Kola Peninsula and Iceland. The history we are taught is bursting at the seams, and through these cracks breaks the cold light of a forgotten northern truth.